Friday, July 22nd. Today you are to read 2 Kings chapters 4 through 6 and Matthew 5. Now there is a lot to cover here, so I'm only going to be highlighting a handful of the stories. Starting in 2 Kings chapter 4 verses 1 through 7, we see the story of a widow who was in debt with only a small jar of olive oil as collateral, so she was scared her sons would be taken away as slaves. Elisha knew her late husband honored God and wanted to help, so he instructed her to gather empty jars from the neighbors and fill them with her one jar of oil. God made it so that her small amount multiplied and filled every single empty jar that they had. And by selling all that oil, she could pay her debts and live on the money that was left over. This story shows God's abundant provision for those who have honored him and those who are in need. I personally love how it also parallels stories like when Jesus fed thousands of people with a small amount of bread and fish, and we see similar parallels of the stories of Jesus throughout today's reading. Moving on to verses 8 through 35, we'll see that as a blessing for a Shunammite woman who was very hospitable to him, Elisha foretold that she would have a son, though her husband was old, and she did. But one day, the boy died rather suddenly. So the woman quickly sought Elisha, who sent his servant to help, but he couldn't revive the boy. So Elisha himself goes through a process of stretching out, laying over the son's body, and he was restored to life. Now this gives an example of what can happen when your very first reaction to something distressing is one of faith. And it shows that even when you're being faithful, waiting and hoping for God's help may still take some patience. Moving on to chapter 5, this tells us about Naaman, a highly regarded and valiant soldier who had leprosy, which was a terrible disease affecting the skin. He was sent to the king of Israel in hopes of being cured, and when Elisha heard this, he had the king send Naaman straight to him. After some pushback about his directions, Naaman listened to Elisha, washed himself in the Jordan, and he was cured. So Naaman and his servants all praised the God of Israel. This is yet another testament to the importance of trusting God to do what's needed. In addition to more parallels with stories of Jesus, this passage starts getting into the idea that the kings in this time period often failed to meet the needs of the people, but God shows his perfect kingship in his miraculous work through the prophet Elisha, who, by the way, is referred to as man of God 16 times in today's reading. At chapter 6, verse 8, we see that Aram and Israel are at war. Elisha warns Israel's king about the Arameans' plans, and the king of Aram hears of Elisha's interference and then sends an army to capture him. Now Elisha's servant starts to panic when he sees this army surrounding the hill. But Elisha tells him, "Don't be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And he prayed, so the servant saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Now the Lord struck the Arameans with blindness at Elisha's request, so he could lead them to Samaria. And there Elisha told Israel's king not to kill them, but to give them a feast and send them on their way. Let this be another reminder that when you align yourself with God, you're never alone and you can trust him to protect you. Now I'm going to flip over to Matthew 5, which starts with the Beatitudes, where Jesus begins his Sermon on the Mount by blessing the good people who suffer for the sake of maintaining righteousness. In verse 11, Jesus says, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven." Now, Jesus goes on to tell the crowds about doing good deeds that serve to glorify the Father. He speaks about his fulfillment of the law so that everything may be accomplished according to his word. Then, starting in verse 21, he takes commands from the law and goes further with them regarding how his people should live. For example, instead of just "do not murder," he urges us to settle matters quickly and not to let anger lead to bitterness. Jesus continues with the topics of adultery, of divorce, making oaths, seeking revenge and hating your enemies. All of this is to urge them not to take the commands lightly, but to go further and do more out of love for Him and all of His people. Now, friends, I sure hope that these readings have reminded you to see God as our perfect King who is more than capable of protecting us, providing for us, healing us, and guiding us in ways of righteousness. Not only that, but He can do amazing things through you. So go ahead and reflect more on that today. And until we see each other again, you are sent.